Eye on the Storm, Hurricane Season 2019.
All right, good evening and welcome to this edition of Eye on the Storm. In Raleigh, North Carolina, I'm WNCN Chief Meteorologist Wes Hohenstein. Thank you for spending some of your night with us. This is our weekly in-depth look at the tropics. We've done it throughout the entire hurricane season. And tonight, as October winds down and we start thinking about November, which, can you believe, starts next week, things are also winding down in the tropics. And while we do have a disturbance to talk about tonight, we're also going to take a look back to 2012 and Hurricane Sandy. Remember that storm? And when the tropics weren't as quiet back then, we're also going to head down to the Gulf Coast to see if Nestor was much ado about nothing. I'll be joined by WMBB's Chief Meteorologist Ross Whitley as we take a look back to just last week and review Tropical Storm Nestor's path and compare that to a few other tropics tracks over the last several years. Now, during tonight's show, if there are any questions that we haven't answered yet during this season or any subjects you would like us to talk about on our final show next week, please email us at sendit@cbs17.com. That's sendit@cbs17.com. Our digital team is monitoring that email address, and we hope to hear from you. As for getting in touch with us directly tonight, here's the best way to do that on social media. You can find me at WeatherWes on Facebook. That's at WeatherWes. And Ross Whitley down in Florida, you can find him at Whitley Weather. Lots of W's in tonight's show. But before we get to tonight's guests, let's take a look at what's going on in the Atlantic. I want to start you off with some interesting facts as we head into the last full week of October. These are from Dr. Phil Klausbach, one of the top hurricane guys in the whole world at Colorado State University in Colorado. First of all, tomorrow is the anniversary of Hurricane Wilma hitting Florida in 2005. So think about that. Tomorrow, we're getting toward the end of October, we had a hurricane on the doorstep of Florida back in 2005. 2005 was the year, it was a record-setting year. We had a lot of storms. We were on the W-named storms in 2005 at this point, where this year we're only on the N-named storm. At one point, Wilma was a Cat 5, so things do happen this time of year. Wilma, tomorrow, the anniversary of it hitting Florida. It wasn't a Cat 5 when it hit Florida, but it was a monster. It had intense rapid intensification. But on the other hand, as we start to look in the Gulf of Mexico, because there is actually a disturbance over central Mexico, over the Yucatan Peninsula, that the National Hurricane Center says has a 30% chance of developing as it moves from its current position over land to over the warm waters of the Gulf of Mexico. So this yellow shaded area is where it could go in the next couple of days, where it has a 30% chance of developing. And right now, where that X is, that's where the system currently is. But listen, only 2 named storms since 1950 have formed this late in the year in the Gulf of Mexico. 2 storms since 1950 have formed in the Gulf. So it's a long shot. It's hard to do this time of year to get something to form. It was Inga back in 1961 and Juan back in 1985. So while that is really the only thing cooking right now in the tropics, the chances of it developing are low. And over time, we have seen that the chances of something forming in the Gulf of Mexico are also very low. This time around, there's actually a cold front it's going to merge with over the next couple of days that will most likely prevent it from ever reaching land. And as you saw, it's a long shot of developing. And as we look way out in the tropical Atlantic, all the way over to Africa, there's not much going on. And one of the things we start to look for this time of year to kind of give us a signal that things really are winding down, you know, most of the summer, July, August, and September, we look for things to come off the coast of Africa, and obviously they would have to move all the way across from east to west. But look at the clouds that are out there now. Which direction are they moving? We've started to get cold fronts here on the East Coast. I mean, it's definitely starting to feel more like fall. Well, I start to look at the clouds out there. Look, they're moving more to the east. So while that's not a definite end to the season, it's definitely an indication that things are starting to change as we head toward winter later this year and when things really start to calm down. So yeah, there's a few things cooking around the intertropical convergence zone, but that's one of the things I always look for are the cloud patterns starting to shift to move into a different direction. And another thing that looks to hold activity down, if anything were to come off the coast of Africa, the Saharan dust forecast. Remember, dust from the deserts of Africa gets blown up into the atmosphere and kind of calms the atmosphere down. So as we look at that forecast for the coming week, from right now to later this week, this weekend, and even well into early next week, you can see the activity, the Saharan dust activity, stays rather active. So that would almost eliminate anything from forming there because, number one, we didn't see anything coming off the coast. We've got a high dust count, and those clouds I showed you starting to move in a different direction, all indications that, you know what, odds are we're not going to have a lot to worry about. And that makes sense when you look at the historic formation points of October storms. So this is all the way back 1851 up to last year. Everywhere you see a dot is where a tropical storm or hurricane formed. And notice where the cluster of the dots is not out here. So just another indication that's going to be really hard for anything to form out there. Most of the stuff that forms this time of year happens in the southern Gulf of Mexico. It happens in the Caribbean. That is one of the more common spots. Also around the Bahamas, but one place we don't look is way out into the Atlantic. And as we start to wind down the season, remember the season officially ends on November 30th. So as we look at the activity over time throughout the season, we get the graph that spikes on September 10th. That's the peak of the season. Well, we are well beyond that. We are well on the downswing toward the end of the season as far as typical tropical activity. But one thing I want to point out, I want to compare that. We're at the same spot of heightened activity to where we are usually in August. So the activity that we would typically get right now over time is very comparable to the activity we get in August. So while everyone's starting to think already about colder temperatures and fall and no hurricanes, this time of year over time does show us that yes, things do happen almost as much as happens in August. So as we kind of start to take a look back at the season that has been, we are already through the N-named storm, Nestor. Remember, that's storm name number 14. And like I just talked about, Wilma in 2005, we had 7 additional storms to get to the W storm. That's how busy that season was. So we've got 14 named storms. We've got 5 hurricanes, but 4 of them have been major hurricanes. It's been a very interesting year. So with that already in the books, I kind of want to take a look back to the beginning of the season when we had the hurricane forecast. The outlook from NC State here in Raleigh, North Carolina, Colorado State out in Colorado, and from our government, NOAA and the Climate Prediction Center. So their forecast for named storms, remember we've had 14 at this point through the N name. That's a little bit above average of 12, but it's right in line pretty much what all the major agencies were saying. 5 hurricanes, the average is 6, so we're right about there, a little below. 5 would fit into what the forecast said. We've had 4 major hurricanes. That has been a shock, I think, to everyone. It's above average, and it's more than everyone predicted with the exception of NOAA. I wanted to show this to you because a lot of times we always focus on how off a long-term 6-month hurricane forecast was, but I've got to hand it to every agency out there. You know, they have nailed it pretty much this season. The forecasts have been right on. But as I pointed out with that graph, you know, October can still produce a lot of activity. Our busiest months of hurricane activity, when hurricanes form, September and August. But in third place, it's not July, it's not June, it is October. 17% of hurricanes throughout the entire season form in October. But the season isn't just continuing for the Atlantic. You know, throughout this year, we've talked a little bit about what's going on in the Pacific. We even dove into the hurricane activity in Hawaii. We had one of their meteorologists on live on the show here. But as we look at in the Pacific right now, there's, you know, a lot of noise, meaning there's a lot of clouds. There's some thunderstorms, mainly along the intertropical convergence zone, but nothing really close to forming. Hawaii's way out here, but their season has been very similar to ours in that they also have had 14 named storms. Their strongest, Kiko and Barbara, Both were Category 4, as was Eric. So a similar season in the Pacific to what we've seen here in the Atlantic. And remember, we've had Cat 4s and Cat 5s. We've had several storms that have reached winds above 130 miles per hour. So quite a year it has been. I'll finish with this little statistic before we bring in our first guest. 7 major hurricanes, major Category 3, 4, or 5, have formed after October 27th, which this year is this Sunday. That's since 1950. The most recent was Otto in 2016. So a lot of different statistics about what happens this time of year, but throughout history since 1950, 7 major hurricanes have formed after October 27th. All right, the most recent storm that we have been dealing with was Nestor. And joining me now from Panama City, Florida, is WMBB's chief meteorologist, Ross Whitley. Ross, we talked to you earlier in the season. You know, Florida is one of the more popular places for hurricane activity this time of year. We've talked about Michael, of course. That's the most disastrous storm in recent memory. But let's talk about the most recent storm and Nestor. I mean, we talked about it a lot up here on the East Coast. How big of a deal was Nestor for you guys down in the Gulf Coast?
Yeah, I don't want to knock the National Hurricane Center too much here, but Nestor really wasn't much of a storm when it comes to our area. We did have some outer islands, St. George Island, and officially St. Vincent Island is that island right there. That's where it made landfall. We had a couple gusts get up to 50 miles per hour and sustained winds about 40, 45. But overall, it really wasn't much of a storm, but does take me to my next point, which was comparison, because many people saw the name storm. They saw the fact that this was a 60-mile-per-hour tropical storm, and they thought, well, this is very close to a hurricane. This could become the next big storm, and immediately everyone went back to Hurricane Michael, which is what I have up here. And I wanted to illustrate the differences as we go through a couple of infamous hurricanes in the Gulf of Mexico, that being Michael of most recent memory, Katrina, and Harvey. 3 big storms all in the Gulf of Mexico impacting different areas, but they also had different impacts that might not be what you remember from those storms in the past. Now, Michael, obviously, it was the wind. It was the core of the storm, and I have highlighted here where it was listed all the way up to a Category 4, reaching parts of Alabama and even southwest Georgia. The core stayed relatively intact, and yes, there were Category 4 type of damage all the way into southwest Georgia. That's when it was officially downgraded into a Category 3 hurricane, and part of that was because of its forward speed. It was moving forward at 14 miles an hour, which means it didn't have a whole lot of time for that core to collapse. So places all the way in our northernmost county here, Jackson County, seeing that type of damage, and obviously a very limited stretch that saw Category 5 type of hurricane and was only listed as a Category 5 for just a few miles before it moved inland and started becoming downgraded to a Category 4. But it wasn't just the wind. There was also a lot of rain associated with it, and even with a fast-moving system, we still had parts of Jackson County record 18.5 inches of rain from a storm that was moving north at 14 miles an hour and eventually ended up affecting places in North Carolina, as well as it turned into more of an extratropical cyclone and merged with that cold front completely. But plenty of rain to be accounted for in this storm, and impacts sometimes are something you should focus on rather than the storm itself. Plenty of people that lived in Jackson County thought, well, I live such and such miles inland, I'll never see a hurricane produce this kind of damage. But a storm that's moving fast can obviously produce damage, and all the way up to a Category 4 type of damage, even 80 miles inland if it's moving fast enough. So you can't just compare to the last storm. And if you compared Michael to Nestor, you would say, well, 2 inches of rain, 40-mile-per-hour winds, not a big deal whatsoever. And that's really how most in this area felt with Tropical Storm Nestor. But because Michael happened last year, everyone immediately thought, well, this is going to be another Michael. Well, no, every storm is different, and every storm is going to have different types of impacts. Obviously, Michael, probably the most atypical type of situation when you get hurricanes and wind. You think wind. Michael was a good example of that. It was a wind-driven hurricane, and that's what we're going to remember most from Michael is the wind, not the rain, maybe the storm surge in Mexico Beach. But how about Katrina? when your mind thinks of Katrina, you think New Orleans. You don't think the size of Katrina, which was over 460 miles wide. You don't think about the wind of Katrina coming in as a Category 3. Gulfport, Mississippi, all the way up to Laurel, Mississippi, seeing winds from 110 to 120 miles per hour, not to mention Gulfport, Mississippi, all the way over to Mobile, seeing anywhere from 10 to 20 feet of storm surge. So people forget that the impacts were felt much further than New Orleans. And in fact, New Orleans really only saw wind up to about 90 miles an hour. I think the top wind speed recorded in New Orleans was 93 miles an hour. And what was the big factor here? Well, it was the broad wind range. It was also another quick moving system, but it was the fact that the wind was coming off of Lake Pontchartrain. The levees there failed, and that's what flooded New Orleans. It wasn't the rain. It wasn't the wind. It was the wind, so to speak. But really, the hardest impact areas wasn't New Orleans with Hurricane Katrina. It was from Slidell all the way over to Pascagoula that saw the biggest storm surge and the highest winds. So impacts felt much further out than just what happened in New Orleans thanks to levees failing. And that's just one thing. You can do this all day with hurricanes of the past. Situations are different on every single storm. How about Hurricane Harvey? We all remember Harvey thanks to Houston getting a lot of rainfall. But Harvey, a slow-moving system, well-forecasted system, relatively small system. It was only about 280 miles wide. It was compact, and because it was slow-moving, it did have compact wind field. So you'll notice here, not the same type of wind field from Katrina, not the same type of wind field that we had with Michael. Hurricane Harvey, however, did have Category 4 types of wind, but only making it about 30 to 40 miles inland, not anywhere close to what Michael or Katrina did, because it was a compact storm and it was only moving onshore at about 3 miles an hour. So areas that saw this eye wall, including Rockport going inland, saw the eye wall for several hours. It wasn't a situation where you were dealing with it for 30, 40, maybe an hour long. You were dealing with this type of eye wall for a couple of hours. Rockport still dealing with the recovery just a couple of years ago, still having to rebuild from that. And again, wind field rather compact, but what do we remember from Harvey? Well, obviously we remember the rainfall because it was such a slow moving system. Over a period of 8 days, it averaged 3 miles per hour going along the coastline. And this was the forecast that was really out there, that was talked about well before the storm, was how much rain was going to fall over parts of Texas and areas even into Louisiana. Look at the rain footprint, over 460 miles wide. Keep that in mind, a system that was only 260 mile wide left a footprint of 460 miles wide of 5 inches of rain or greater, obviously setting the state Texas rainfall record for a tropical system, and a wide footprint for 30 to 40 inches of rain as well, including well inland, 20 to 30 inches of rain, 10 inches of rain, and again, 5 inches of rain. So sometimes it's best not to compare the last system, because every system, obviously, from 3 systems here that are rather impactful, you get a different situation entirely. And that's why you really shouldn't go back to the last storm and say, this storm's going to be like this storm, or this storm's going to be like this storm. Nope, the forecast is going to be dependent on your specific location and your specific impacts storm to storm. It's always a variable. So many of these storms people remember, but they may not remember exactly what happened, or maybe not even the most important details with the storm overall. And I think that's a good comparison to what many people here thought about when Nestor was coming in. They thought, oh, this is going to be another Michael, this is going to be another situation like that. And that's just not fair. You can look at 3 storms that we all know, or we think we know really well, and they're all different.
Yeah, good point, Ross. Let me ask you, so storm surge down in the Panhandle of Florida, one of the worst things you guys can get, wind right up there. What would you all do in Florida, in the Panhandle, which is very flat, with 20 to 30 inches of rain like some of these other storms have dropped?
Yeah, and honestly, we've been thankful to not have a slow-moving system like Harvey come here into the Panhandle, because we actually do have a good bit of elevation just inland. We have elevation about 20 to 30 feet with the sandhills here in Florida. It's one of the only areas in Florida that does have elevation. And so if you can imagine, if we had 20 to 30 inches of rain fall on that elevation and get down into those areas that are easily flood prone, we would have a disaster on our hands. We would definitely be needing people to evacuate. If we had a forecast like this, we would be screaming evacuations before the storm came in because there's no way this area could handle that kind of rain with, ironically, maybe the exception being the coastline. The coastline might be the only area with a storm like this that could deal with the water. Once you got inland, evacuations would be necessary. And I know that you guys even there experienced that somewhat with Florence last year, that the problem was not having a center for people to go to. The problem was, well, how do we get those people there now that all the roads are flooded?
Right, right. You know, I always think of Florida as the veterans of the hurricane experience community. But in late October, even though it's not over, even though I just read off some statistics about how many storms can still form, do people down there in Florida, is the season over for them? Have they written it off already, even though it's technically not?
No, definitely not. I think everyone has marked on their calendar November 30th, and that's the day that they decide to start partying when hurricane season ends, because we know all too well from last year, years past, that it doesn't take much for a storm to form, rapidly intensify, and then come ashore. I mean, you highlighted Wilma being around this time in 2005. And we've had seasons where storms even affecting the Panhandle here later than that. Our latest storm on record was Kate, and that made landfall November 23rd in the 1970s. I don't know exactly what year that was, but so even this area knows that late into November we can still get a hurricane.
Wow. Ross, I'll get you out of here on this one, and it's not a tropical question, but you know, the rest of the United States, once hurricane season's over, we turn our attention to cold, snow, and ice. I'm curious, and I know you guys don't hardly ever get that down there, but what's your biggest weather concern in the winter down there?
Yeah, we had the last polar panhandle we had, I think it's what it was dubbed, was 2014. We had about a half an inch of freezing rain and sleet, and that was a nightmare for our area. So hopefully that doesn't happen anytime soon. I'm really hoping for no cold, but actually, yeah, winter is that's our off season, man. That's when we like the weather down here. That's when everybody from Canada, New York, anyone that's done with the cold, you come down here. We'll take you in. We'll make you family and have some fun. But we have our second severe weather season is unfolding. We just had a severe weather day a couple days ago. So in the winter, the cold fronts, that's when we watch for our tornadoes and things like that. North Carolina is the same. You have two severe weather seasons, spring and fall, and we get that basically all winter. But winter is definitely our off season. We like winter.
Right. And if 2014 was the last time you guys had a serious snow and ice threat, we're not friends anymore. We have that very often up here. But excellent job with the tropical talk tonight and teasing us with some convention and visitors bureau talk. We can come down there in the winter. Ross, good to see you again. That is Ross Whitley down at our sister station in Panama City, Florida. You know, another storm that hit right about this time of year 7 years ago, that was Hurricane Sandy. I'm going to show you a look at the path. Remember that? A lot of us knew it as Superstorm Sandy, but it formed on October 22nd, lasted all the way to the second day of November. It made landfall up in the Northeast. A lot of flooding problems, a lot of storm surge problems. Here's a look at the big picture. This was an interesting one for many reasons, but when it started off, it actually did a little U-turn. And unfortunately devastated Cuba, and then came up just off the East Coast, kind of flirting, going in and out, if you'll remember that. And then it made that last turn to the left that brought it inland. It was the second costliest hurricane in United States history. Sandy was a Category 3 storm as it peaked intensity when it made landfall in Cuba, causing an estimated $70 billion in damage in its lifetime. It was the fourth costliest storm behind Katrina in 2005 and Hurricanes Harvey and Maria in 2017, all storms we've mentioned today. And according to NOAA, at least 233 people were killed along the path of the storm in 8 different countries. The death toll in the U.S., directly attributed to Sandy includes almost 50 people in New York, 12 in New Jersey, 5 in Connecticut, 2 in Pennsylvania, and 5 in other states. And again, Sandy was a late season October storm. Hurricane Sandy actually weakened to a post-tropical cyclone on its way to making landfall along the coast of New Jersey. Again, that was 7 years ago. Its storm surge hit New York City on the 29th of October, just a couple days of Halloween. Remember, a lot of communities had to cancel Halloween that year. Tunnels and subway lines were closed. Power was out around the city. But I want you to take a look back at CBS News correspondent Allison Harmelin as she shows you some of the devastation that rocked the New Jersey coastline 7 years ago.
President Obama arrived in New Jersey for a close-up look at the damage. The president took a chopper tour with Governor Chris Christie over devastated areas of the state where Superstorm Sandy hit with full force. Record storm surge took out Atlantic City's boardwalk. In the tiny beach community of Longport, New Jersey, the storm surge brought the beach literally right onto the main street. There are feet and feet of sand piled up as if it were a snowstorm. The Real family came out on bicycles to see the devastation.
Never saw sand like that. That's the one thing. That's due to the storm surge, I think.
Farther up the Jersey shore, this is what's left of the famous boardwalk in Seaside Heights. The roller coaster sits crumpled in the ocean, the Ferris wheel suspended over open water. The storm lifted homes off their foundations and crumpled up boats. In the town of Maniloking, fires continued to burn on a stream of natural gas leaks. In Hoboken, residents are trapped in their homes and waiting for rescue. The water has no place to go.
It will just take time before it eventually works its way out of the area, or it has to be pumped out.
Newark Airport reopened, but millions of homes remain without power. Streets are canals, and while the rebuilding is already underway, New Jersey knows it may never be the same. Allison Harmelin for CBS News, Atlantic City, New Jersey.
And that was a look back at the aftermath of Hurricane Sandy, which hit 7 years ago. Remember, it was a late October storm, and then November, parts of that country already are dealing with snow that time of year. So it was a very interesting year from hurricanes directly into snow, October and November. And again, the season does not end officially until November 30th. We are ending right now, though, for tonight. I want to thank you for joining us on tonight's Eye on the Storm. Don't forget, next week at 8 o'clock is our last scheduled show for this Atlantic hurricane season, so be sure to tune in then. I want to thank you for spending part of your night with us live in Raleigh, North Carolina. I'm Wes Hohenstein.